Eleanor Blackwood, a 62-year-old divorcee, stands on the brink of an unimaginable twist. After 34 years of marriage, her ex-husband, Richard, left her for Victoria, expecting to inherit his father William's $12.7 million empire. But William's will, sealed for 3 years, holds a secret that could upend everything. As Richard's lavish new life unravels and Eleanor quietly rebuilds, a cryptic conversation with William haunts her. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. With the will's revelation looming, what shocking truth awaits, and how will it reshape Eleanor's future? The suspense builds toward a life-changing moment. If Eleanor's gripping journey moved you, join our community. Subscribe now to catch more inspiring stories like hers. Share where you're tuning in from below, and don't miss tomorrow's special tale. Your support fuels our storytelling. Click that button and stay connected for more unforgettable moments. The judge's gaze pierced over the rim of his glasses, his voice steady as he uttered words that sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, please step forward to claim your inheritance." A collective gasp echoed off the high ceilings, and every pair of eyes swiveled toward me. I rose from the back row, my legs unsteady, my hands trembling, as I smoothed the creases of my simple navy dress, its fabric worn but meticulously pressed. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of a truth I'd carried in silence for 3 long years. My ex-husband, Richard, sat frozen, his face drained of color, as pale as the marble floor beneath us. Beside him, his new wife, Victoria, fumbled, her designer purse slipping from her manicured fingers to the ground with a soft thud. They couldn't know, that this moment was the culmination of a secret I'd guarded with quiet resolve, a secret poised to unravel everything they thought they understood. 3 years earlier, I was Eleanor Blackwood, a 62-year-old woman who believed she had mapped out the rest of her days. For 34 years, I had been Richard's wife, nurturing our 2 children, Sarah and Michael, who had long since left our modest 2-story home in Salem, Oregon, to chase careers across the country. My life had settled into a rhythm of small joys, tending the roses and lavender in our backyard garden, watching the seasons shift through the kitchen window, and savoring the quiet of an ordinary life. Richard, a bank manager, provided stability, if not extravagance. We weren't rich, but we had enough, or so I believed. My days of teaching elementary school were a distant memory, abandoned 28 years ago when Sarah was born, a choice I made without regret, but with the lingering ache of a life I might have lived. Richard's father, William Blackwood, was a different world entirely. A titan of industry, he owned swaths of commercial real estate in downtown Portland, an empire built from the humble foundation of a hardware store inherited in the 1960s. William was a man of sharp edges, cold, calculating, and perpetually disappointed in those around him, especially me. To him, I was an unworthy match for his son, a mere school teacher from a working-class family, a blemish on the Blackwood legacy. At family gatherings, his indifference was palpable. He referred to me only as Richard's wife, my name seemingly too trivial for his tongue. His disdain stung, but I bore it quietly, masking my hurt behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. The relationship between Richard and his father was a tangle of unspoken expectations and quiet resentments. William had groomed Richard to inherit the family empire, but Richard's choice to pursue banking over the family business had been a betrayal in his father's eyes. Still, as William's only child, Richard was the presumed heir to the vast fortune. William had never remarried after Richard's mother passed during his college years, and with no other siblings, the math seemed straightforward. The estate would pass to Richard. Or so we thought. I still remember the last time I spoke to William, at his 80th birthday celebration at the country club where he'd held court for decades. I had poured myself into making the event flawless, arranging vibrant bouquets, coordinating with caterers, greeting guests with warmth despite the chill of William's indifference. As the evening drew to a close, he pulled me aside near the courtroom, his gravelly voice rough from years of cigar smoke. "Eleanor," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You've been a dutiful wife to my son." I braced for a rare kindness, a flicker of approval after decades of dismissal. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. "But duty doesn't always bring the rewards you expect." His words hung in the air, cryptic and heavy, like a riddle I wasn't meant to solve. I offered a polite smile, wished him a happy birthday, and pushed the moment to the back of my mind, chalking it up to his usual enigmatic cruelty. 6 months later, William was gone. A heart attack claimed him in his study on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. Richard found him, slumped over his desk, when he went to check after William missed their weekly breakfast. The funeral was a grand affair, a spectacle of Portland's elite, business magnates, politicians, and society figures filling the cathedral with their somber presence. I wore my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral, and sat beside Richard, playing the part of the grieving daughter-in-law. Inside, I felt a quiet detachment, a sense that something larger was at play, though I couldn't name it. The reading of the will came the following Friday in the imposing office of William's attorney, Mr. Harrison. The room was a fortress of dark wood paneling and leather-bound books, reeking of old money and solemn decisions. Richard and I sat across from Mr. Harrison's massive mahogany desk, the air thick with anticipation. Richard was a bundle of nerves, his fingers tapping restlessly, his mind already racing toward dreams of European vacations or a remodeled kitchen. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my thoughts circling back to William's cryptic words at the party. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and opened a thick manila folder, his voice measured. Before we begin, I should note that Mr. Blackwood's will contains some unusual provisions. I urged him to reconsider, but he was resolute. Richard leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What kind of provisions?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began. To Richard, he left $50,000 in personal effects, his watch collection, the contents of his study. Richard's face crumpled, confusion replacing expectation. $50,000 was significant, but it was a pittance compared to the millions everyone assumed he'd inherit. Mr. Harrison continued, detailing minor bequests to charities and loyal employees, but the core of the estate, the real estate empire, the investments, the business holdings, remained unaddressed. Then came the revelation that stopped my heart. The remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $12.7 million, I leave to be held in trust, Mr. Harrison read, his voice steady but weighted. Richard leaned forward, expecting to hear his name as the beneficiary, but Mr. Harrison wasn't done. This trust shall be administered by Harrison, Klein, and Associates, with all assets managed and preserved for a period of no less than 3 years from the date of my death. Richard's jaw tightened. 3 years, he interrupted, his voice sharp. What happens after 3 years? Mr. Harrison's expression remained unreadable as he held up a cream-colored envelope sealed with William's distinctive wax crest. After 3 years, the trust assets will be distributed according to conditions specified in this sealed envelope, which is not to be opened until that time. Mr. Blackwood was explicit that these instructions remain confidential, even from me. Richard sat back, stunned, his mind grappling with the ambiguity. I felt a strange calm, as if a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving had clicked into place. William had always been a man who thrived on control, on keeping others off balance. This was his final act of mastery, a game with rules only he knew. The drive home was heavy with tension. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he alternated between fury and bewilderment. Maybe it's a test, he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Maybe he wants to see how we handle this. I nodded, murmuring agreement, but my thoughts were elsewhere. William's words from the birthday party echoed relentlessly. Duty doesn't always bring the rewards you expect. They felt like a warning, a challenge, a key to something I couldn't yet grasp. Life moved forward, but the shadow of the trust loomed large. Richard became consumed, poring over his father's papers, calling Mr. Harrison's office incessantly, even hiring a private investigator to dig into William's final months. He was desperate for answers, for a hint of what lay in that sealed envelope. I watched him unravel, his obsession casting a pall over our home. Yet I carried on, tending my garden, cooking dinners, and holding the fragments of our life together. Inside, I felt a quiet certainty growing, a sense that William's final words to me held the truth of what was to come. The secret I'd kept buried, the one I hadn't yet dared to voice, was stirring, ready to change everything. For over 3 decades, I had built a life with Richard, a life woven from shared dreams, quiet routines, and the steady rhythm of our days together in Salem. My mornings were filled with the simple pleasures of tending my garden, where I coaxed tomatoes and roses to life with careful hands, and my afternoons often passed at the local library, where I volunteered, surrounded by the comforting weight of books. Every Thursday, I met my dear friend Margaret for lunch, our conversations a tapestry of laughter and shared confidences. Yet, beneath this familiar cadence, my thoughts were increasingly consumed by William, Richard's father, and the conversation we'd had before his passing. His eyes had held mine with an intensity that felt deliberate, his words chosen with a precision that hinted at something unspoken. It was as if he'd been trying to prepare me for something, a warning cloaked in kindness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a piece of a puzzle he'd left behind. 6 months after William's death, Richard began to speak of the future with a new fervor. One evening, as we cleared the dinner table, the clink of dishes punctuating the silence, he turned to me with a gleam in his eyes. "Eleanor, when this is all settled, when I inherit everything, I think it's time we shake things up." His voice carried a buoyancy I hadn't heard in years, but it stirred a quiet unease in me. I asked what he meant, my hands pausing over the sink, suds clinging to my fingers. "We'll be wealthy, truly wealthy," he said, his words brimming with possibility. "We could live a life most people only dream of." Over the weeks that followed, his visions grew sharper, more vivid. He spoke of a grand house in an exclusive neighborhood, of joining the country club where his father had once held court, of jetting off to distant corners of the world. But his words, though dazzling, felt hollow to me. They were laced with eye-based statements that left little room for we. "I'll buy that mansion on Riverside Drive," he'd say, or "I've always wanted a yacht." When I reminded him that these were decisions we'd make together, he'd chuckle, his hand brushing mine in a way that felt more dismissive than affectionate. "Of course, dear," he'd say, "but you know I'll handle the finances. You've never been great with money." The words stung, not just because they were untrue. I had balanced our household budget with precision for years, but because they carried a condescension that felt like a betrayal of the partnership we'd built. A year after William's death, the distance between us grew palpable. Richard was often absent, claiming late nights at work or weekend trips to Portland to oversee the trust's business interests. When he was home, his presence felt like a shadow, his attention tethered to his phone or some unspoken preoccupation. Our conversations dwindled to clipped exchanges about groceries or schedules, the warmth of our old banter replaced by a cold efficiency. I began to notice subtle shifts in him: new clothes, tailored and expensive, a cologne I didn't recognize, sharp and unfamiliar. He joined a gym, spoke of networking and expanding his circle, words that felt foreign in our quiet Salem life. When I suggested joining him for these social outings, his excuses were swift and vague: events too formal, crowds I wouldn't enjoy. Each rejection landed like a small cut, eroding the confidence I'd once had in our shared world. One spring evening, Richard returned from a Portland trip transformed, his energy electric, his smile brighter than I'd seen in months. Over dinner, he spoke animatedly of a gallery opening, a wine tasting, a dinner party at a penthouse overlooking the city. His stories painted a world of sophistication, one that felt galaxies away from our modest life. I listened, my fork heavy in my hand, and ventured, "Richard, those sound wonderful. I'd love to come with you sometime." He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, and fixed me with a look that chilled me, a mix of pity and detachment. "Eleanor, honey," he said, his voice soft but cutting, "I don't think you'd fit in with that crowd. They're sophisticated, business people, investors, people who understand art and finance. It's just not your world." The words hit like a slap, leaving me breathless. After 34 years of marriage, of shared sacrifices and joys, he was dismissing me as unfit for his new life. I finished my meal in silence, the food tasteless, and later sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the familiar patterns of our quilt, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the stranger downstairs. That summer, Richard's behavior grew erratic, shrouded in secrecy. He took private calls, stepping onto the patio or retreating to his study, the door clicking shut behind him. His Portland trips multiplied, sometimes stretching overnight, and when I asked about them, his responses were sharp, accusing me of being clingy or suspicious. One sweltering July afternoon, as I watered my tomatoes, their leaves curling in the heat, our neighbor Mrs. Chen approached the fence. Her usual warmth was tempered by unease, her fingers fidgeting with her gardening gloves. "Eleanor," she said hesitantly, "is everything okay with you and Richard? I've seen him leaving at odd hours, and last week he was loading suitcases into his car at 6 in the morning. I was worried something was wrong." Her words sank into me, heavy with implication. I reassured her, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest, but her observation gnawed at me. Richard hadn't mentioned any early trips. That evening, when I casually asked about his plans, he claimed he'd be working from home. When I mentioned Mrs. Chen's comment, his face darkened, and he snapped, "Are you having the neighbors spy on me now?" The argument that followed was our first in years, raw and unfiltered. He called me paranoid, controlling. I accused him of secrecy, of shutting me out. He stormed out, declaring he was going to Portland and would be back by morning. He didn't return for 3 days. When he finally came home, he was calm, but it was a cold, calculated calm. He sat me down at the kitchen table, his voice measured, rehearsed. "Eleanor, we need to talk about our future. This marriage isn't working. We've grown apart, want different things. I think we should separate." The words hung between us, sharp and final. I stared at him, this man who had been my partner for over 3 decades, and saw only a stranger. "Richard, what are you saying? Yes, things have been hard, but we can work through this. Counseling, anything." He shook his head, unmoved. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want a divorce." The finality of it stole my breath. He went on, his voice steady but cruel. "I've been unhappy for a long time, and I think you have too, even if you won't admit it. We're not the same people we were. I want to live the life I was meant to live." My heart pounded as I asked, "What kind of life, Richard? One where you're ashamed of me? Where you go to fancy parties and pretend I don't exist?" His flush confirmed I'd struck a nerve. "I'm not pretending," he said, defensive. "I'm becoming who I was always meant to be. And that doesn't include a small-town housewife who's never been anywhere or done anything." The cruelty of his words cut deeper than I could have imagined. A small-town housewife. After years of supporting his career, raising our children, managing our home, standing by him through every triumph and trial, that was how he saw me. The divorce was swift, brutal, and meticulously planned. Richard had cataloged our assets, consulted attorneys, and devised a strategy to divide our life. Oregon's no-fault divorce laws meant the reasons for our unraveling were irrelevant. Only the splitting of our shared world mattered. But the proceedings revealed a truth more devastating than his request for divorce. For over a year, Richard had been living a double life. He'd rented an apartment in Portland, joined an elite social club, and spent our savings, our shared future, on a lifestyle we couldn't sustain. Credit card debt, a home equity loan, our savings drained, all to fund a persona I didn't recognize. The revelations broke something in me, not just for the betrayal, but for the realization that the man I'd loved had been slipping away long before he'd spoken the word divorce. The conference room was sterile, all polished wood and crisp paperwork, as Richard's attorney laid out their proposed settlement with a practiced air of confidence. The terms hit me like a cold wind. After 34 years of marriage, during which I had poured my life into our home, our family, and supporting Richard's ambitions, his legal team argued I deserved only a sliver of what we'd built together. They pointed to my years as a homemaker, framing it as though I'd been idle, uninvolved in the wealth Richard had amassed through property and investments he controlled. Their offer? The house, a grand gesture they claimed, until I saw the fine print. It came saddled with a mountain of debt Richard had racked up without my knowledge. They also tossed in half of our dwindled savings, a paltry sum barely scraping $30,000 after Richard's reckless spending. My stomach churned as I sat there, the weight of betrayal settling deeper with every word. But the real blow, the one that felt like a knife twisting in my chest, was buried in the financial disclosures. Richard had been unfaithful. Her name was Victoria Sterling, a woman who seemed to embody everything I wasn't. 20 years younger, a poised and successful art dealer, draped in sophistication and effortlessly at home in the elite social circles Richard had always yearned to infiltrate. They'd met 8 months ago at a gallery opening, and as the timeline coldly spelled out, their affair had sparked almost immediately. I could picture it vividly. Richard, with his polished charm and restless ambition, captivated by Victoria's elegance, her youth, her world of glittering connections. Each detail felt like a fresh wound, reopening the quiet insecurities I'd buried for decades. Had I ever been enough for him? Had our life together, the one I'd poured my heart into, ever truly mattered? My attorney, Sandra Mills, a sharp but overworked woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the settlement with a frown that deepened by the second. "Eleanor, this is a travesty," she said, her voice low but firm. "You've given 34 years to this marriage, your time, your energy, your sacrifices. You deserve far more than this insult of a deal." Her words were a lifeline, but they couldn't erase the sinking feeling in my gut. When we pushed back, Richard's legal team came at us like sharks, armed with documentation that painted him as the sole architect of our wealth. Every major financial decision, they claimed, had been his alone. My role, reduced to nothing, as if my years of managing our home, supporting his career, and keeping our life together had no value. The truth was brutal. I had little leverage. The house was underwater, drowning in loans Richard had taken out behind my back. Our savings were nearly gone. The only glimmer of hope was Richard's expected inheritance from his father's trust, but that was still over a year away, and its contents were a mystery. I felt like a ghost in my own life, erased from the story Richard was rewriting. One negotiation session stood out, raw and humiliating. Richard's attorney, a man with a voice as smooth as it was condescending, slid a document across the table. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his eyes glinting with calculated generosity, "my client is prepared to be magnanimous. He'll give you the house, free and clear, along with $50,000 in cash. In exchange, you'll waive any claim to future assets, including any inheritance from his father's estate." The room seemed to shrink as I stared at the paper, the implications sinking in. Richard was so certain of his father's millions that he was willing to buy me off with pocket change to secure it all for himself, $50,000. A pittance to him, a small price to ensure I'd never touch the fortune he believed was his destiny. I could feel his dismissal of me, his utter lack of respect, like a physical weight. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning anger I hadn't yet named. Sandra urged me to reject the offer. "Eleanor, if Richard inherits even a fraction of what people expect, $50,000 will be laughable," she said, her eyes searching mine for a spark of fight. "You need to hold on to your claim to marital assets, including that inheritance." But I was exhausted, bone-deep, soul-weary exhausted. I was tired of battling, tired of being painted as the grasping ex-wife clawing at money I hadn't earned. Tired of watching the man I'd loved for decades morph into a stranger. One who looked at me with indifference, if he looked at me at all. Against Sandra's advice, I signed the agreement. I took the house, the $50,000, and walked away from any claim to Richard's future. Sandra stared at me, disbelief etched across her face. "Eleanor, you could be giving up millions. Are you sure?" I nodded, my voice steady as I told her I was certain. What I didn't say was that a quiet suspicion had taken root in my mind. Richard's father, William, had always been a man of principle, and I had a nagging feeling that his trust might not unfold the way Richard expected. The divorce was finalized on a bleak October morning, the sky heavy with gray clouds that mirrored the ache in my chest. Richard sat across from me, his face alight with a smug confidence as we signed the final papers. He was already planning his new life with Victoria, already spending a fortune he didn't yet have. Outside the courthouse, he had the gall to shake my hand, his grip firm and performative. "You'll see, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with patronizing assurance. "This is better for both of us. You can live the simple life you're suited for, and I can finally reach my potential." The words stung, each one a reminder of how little he valued the life we'd shared. I didn't respond, just turned and walked away, the weight of his dismissal settling into my bones. I moved back into the house, mine now, along with its crushing mortgage and the ghosts of 34 years of memories. Richard relocated to Portland, where he and Victoria began their life together openly. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Their lavish engagement party splashed across Portland's society pages. The photos showed Richard in a tailored tuxedo, Victoria radiant in a designer gown, surrounded by the kind of people Richard had always chased. Wealthy, connected, glamorous. I could almost hear his laughter, see the triumph in his eyes as he stepped into the world he'd always craved. Meanwhile, I spent that winter learning to live alone for the first time in decades. I used the settlement money to chip away at the house's debt, took a part-time job at the local library, and began piecing together a life that didn't revolve around Richard. It was lonely, yes, but there was a quiet freedom in it. No more tiptoeing around his moods, no more pretending I was enough when I clearly wasn't. For the first time, I could breathe. Spring brought news of Richard and Victoria's wedding plans, set for early summer, perfectly timed just before the 3-year waiting period for William's trust would end. Richard was orchestrating everything with precision: marry his dazzling new wife, inherit his father's fortune, and step into the life he'd always believed was his birthright. But I wasn't thinking about their wedding. My mind kept circling back to a conversation with William 3 years earlier at his 80th birthday party. His words had been cryptic, delivered with a knowing glint in his eye. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. I'd replayed that moment endlessly, dissecting every syllable, every fleeting expression on his weathered face. William had watched Richard's casual disregard for me over the years, had seen how I'd held our family together while Richard chased his ambitions. What if his words hadn't been a vague musing, but a deliberate hint? What if William, with his sharp sense of justice, had crafted his trust to right a wrong? The thought grew stronger, more certain, but I kept it locked inside. If I was right, the truth would reveal itself soon enough. If I was wrong, it wouldn't matter. Richard and Victoria's wedding was the talk of Portland's social scene, a lavish affair at the same country club where William had celebrated his milestone birthday. The newspaper photos captured Victoria's stunning gown and Richard's self-assured smile, as if he'd already claimed his father's millions. He even told a reporter they were looking forward to a bright future with significant family business on the horizon. I didn't attend, of course, but the invitation arrived anyway, printed on exorbitant paper with gold embossing and hand-calligraphed details. A tasteless jab or a calculated flex? I couldn't decide. I tossed it in the trash, but not before its extravagance confirmed what I already knew. Richard was spending as if the inheritance was already his. As summer faded into fall, the deadline for William's trust loomed closer. By mid-October, I received a call from Mr. Harrison's secretary, informing me that the final distribution of William Blackwood's estate would take place on November 15th at 2 p.m. in the law firm's conference room. As Richard's former wife, I was invited to attend, though she emphasized it was likely a formality and I shouldn't expect to be affected. I accepted, telling no one of my plans. Richard and Victoria probably assumed they'd waltz into that room and walk out as one of Oregon's wealthiest couples. I could imagine Richard's anticipation, his certainty that his father's fortune was his ticket to the life he'd always wanted. The days before November 15th dragged on, each one a tangle of nervous hope and quiet dread. I alternated between imagining the moment Mr. Harrison would unseal William's trust and wondering if I'd built this all up in my head. Had I misread William's words? Was I clinging to a false hope? Yet something deep inside, a stubborn, quiet instinct, told me I wasn't wrong. William had seen me, truly seen me, in a way Richard never had. And as I prepared to walk into that conference room, I carried a fragile but growing certainty that the truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light. The rain fell in a soft, relentless patter against my bedroom window, a gray veil cloaking the Oregon morning of November 15th. I hadn't needed an alarm to wake me before dawn. My restless mind had done that job all too well. Lying in the quiet darkness, I listened to the rhythmic tapping, each drop a reminder of the weight of this day. My thoughts drifted to a life that might have been, Richard and I, still married, navigating the morning together with a familiar dance of shared routines. He'd be pacing, checking his watch obsessively, his nerves cloaked in excitement about the inheritance he was certain would be his. We'd probably bicker over trivial things, like whether his tie was too flashy or if my dress was formal enough for such a moment. Instead, I was alone, clutching a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring out at the small garden I'd tended for years. That garden had become my refuge, a quiet teacher of lessons I hadn't sought but desperately needed. 35 years ago, when I first started coaxing life from the soil, Richard had laughed, calling it a waste of time to fuss over dirt and weeds. He never saw what I did, that gardening was about faith in the unseen, about nurturing roots that grew in darkness, about learning to wait. It taught me to distinguish between what was merely dormant and what was truly dead, to believe that with care and time, even the most unlikely things could bloom. Lately, I'd been thinking about that a lot, wondering if the hope I'd clung to for 3 years was a seed still waiting for its season or a delusion I should have buried long ago. That hope stemmed from William, Richard's father, a man whose sharp eyes had seen through his son's flaws for decades. William had never approved of the way Richard treated me, the casual disregard that eroded our marriage over 30 years. He'd watched as I poured my devotion into a man who took it for granted, and I'd always sensed William's quiet respect for my endurance. He was a man who valued accountability, who believed actions should have consequences. In the sleepless nights since his death, I dared to imagine that he might have crafted his will to reflect those beliefs, a lesson for Richard about duty, loyalty, and the worth of a woman who'd given everything. It was a fragile possibility, one that sent my heart racing in quiet moments, but it was enough to keep me tethered to this day. By noon, I'd changed outfits 3 times, each choice a battle between looking confident and fading into the background. I wanted to appear poised, not presumptuous, respectable without drawing attention. Finally, I settled on a charcoal gray dress, its clean lines softened by a simple black blazer. I added my grandmother's pearl necklace, its quiet elegance the only luxury I owned, and low heels that wouldn't falter if my nerves did. Standing before the mirror, I studied myself, a woman in her late 50s, lines etched by time and heartbreak, but still standing. I wondered if William had seen that strength, if it had mattered to him at all. The 45-minute drive to Portland felt both endless and fleeting. I rehearsed answers to questions I might face. Why are you here? What right do you have to these? The truth was simple. I'd been invited by Mr. Harrison's office, but I knew my presence would raise eyebrows. Richard likely assumed I was too bitter or proud to attend, or perhaps he'd erased me from his mind entirely, a relic of a past he'd moved beyond. Victoria, his young wife, probably knew me only as a vague shadow in his history, an inconvenient chapter he'd closed. As I navigated the rain-slicked roads, I gripped the steering wheel, steadying myself against the churn of anticipation and dread. Harrison Clean and Associates occupied the top floors of a sleek downtown office tower, its lobby a study in marble and brass, designed to exude wealth and permanence. The receptionist, a young woman with flawless hair, greeted me with polite indifference, her eyes flicking to her screen before directing me to the conference room on the 32nd floor. The elevator ride was a slow ascent into uncertainty, each floor number glowing like a countdown. I pressed a hand to my chest, willing my heart to slow, reminding myself that whatever happened in the next hour would end 3 years of wondering. Whether my hope was validated or shattered, I'd finally know. The conference room was grander than I'd imagined, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a breathtaking view of Portland's skyline and the distant mountains, their peaks softened by the drizzle. A long, polished table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that screamed expense. Mr. Harrison was already there, arranging papers with the solemnity of a man preparing for a ritual. He acknowledged me with a nod, his voice formal but kind. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for coming. Please make yourself comfortable. The others will arrive soon." I took the chair he indicated near the back, hoping to blend into the room's edges, and tried to focus on the view rather than the knot in my stomach. Richard arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled start, his punctuality as predictable as ever. To him, tardiness was a sin, a sign of disrespect and disorder. He wore a navy suit I didn't recognize, tailored to perfection, paired with a silk tie that likely cost more than my monthly grocery bill. His hair was freshly styled, his posture radiating the confidence of a man certain of his fortune. Victoria glided in behind him, a vision of effortless elegance. Her honey blonde hair cascaded in flawless waves, her cream-colored dress a masterclass in subtle luxury. Her designer handbag and heels seemed to belong in a world far removed from mine, and she moved with the ease of someone born to command such spaces. I couldn't help but envy her poise, even as I resented the life she'd stepped into. When Richard's eyes scanned the room and landed on me, his expression shifted from smug anticipation to stunned confusion. "Eleanor?" His voice cut through the quiet, louder than the formal setting allowed, drawing every gaze to me. My cheeks burned, the weight of their stares pinning me to my chair. I'd hoped to remain unnoticed until the proceedings began, but that illusion was gone. "I was invited," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Mr. Harrison's office called last week." Richard turned to the attorney, his face demanding answers. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, consulting his papers. "Mrs. Blackwood was indeed invited," he confirmed. Mr. Blackwood's instructions were explicit about who should be present for the final distribution. Everyone named in the original will was to be notified and given the opportunity to attend. Richard's confusion deepened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he guided Victoria to seats at the opposite end of the table, their movements claiming the space as their rightful domain. As the room filled with other attendees, Mr. Clean, Harrison's partner, William's thin, bespectacled accountant, a bank representative, and a court reporter setting up her equipment with practiced efficiency, I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Each new arrival heightened the tension, the air thick with anticipation. At precisely 2 o'clock, Mr. Harrison called the meeting to order, standing at the head of the table with a cream-colored envelope that had remained sealed for 3 years. His voice carried the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the final distribution of the estate of William James Blackwood, pursuant to the terms of his last will and testament. As you know, Mr. Blackwood stipulated that this envelope not be opened until exactly 3 years after his death. That time has now passed, and we may proceed." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on each face as if committing the moment to memory. Before I open these instructions, I must emphasize that Mr. Blackwood was of sound mind when he made these provisions. He consulted extensively with our firm, and his wishes, however unexpected, are legally binding and will be executed precisely as written. Richard shifted in his chair, his impatience palpable. Victoria placed a manicured hand on his arm, a gesture that seemed meant to soothe but struck me as possessive, a subtle claim on the fortune she assumed was theirs. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, every nerve attuned to the envelope in Mr. Harrison's hands. 3 years of hope, fear, and quiet longing had led to this moment. Whatever lay within those pages would either affirm the faith I'd placed in William's sense of justice or prove me a fool for believing in it at all. I sat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, fingers digging into my palms as I fought to project an air of calm. Inside, my mind was a tempest, swirling with questions about what secrets William's will might reveal, what wounds it might reopen. Across the table, Mr. Harrison, the estate attorney, handled a letter opener that gleamed like a prop from a grand ceremony, slicing open the envelope with surgical precision. He drew out several sheets of paper, unfolding them with a reverence that matched the gravity of the moment. His face remained impassive, but a slight arch of his eyebrows betrayed a flicker of surprise as he skimmed the contents. He read the document silently first, his eyes moving swiftly over the lines, then lifted his gaze to the small group gathered in the room. "These instructions are thorough," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "To honor them, I'll read them in their entirety rather than attempt a summary." He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began, his tone as steady as if he were reading a routine contract rather than delivering a man's final reckoning. William Blackwood's words came next, not as a simple will, but as a testament to a lifetime of observation. He had made his decisions with care, he wrote, after years of watching those around him, their actions, their values, their hearts. His estate, built through decades of relentless work, would be distributed based on his judgment of our character, our choices, our treatment of others. Richard, my ex-husband, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Mr. Harrison with a hunger that bordered on desperation. His polished suit and confident posture couldn't mask the greed in his stare. the assumption that his father's wealth was his by right. Beside him, Victoria, his new wife, maintained her flawless composure. But I noticed the tension in her shoulders, a subtle stiffness that hinted at her unease. I focused on keeping my breath steady, my face a blank mask, though my heart raced, pounding against my ribs like a caged bird. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice unwavering. To his son, Richard James Blackwood, William had already given $50,000 in his personal effects. That was the extent of his inheritance. The bequest was a deliberate judgment, a reflection of Richard's character, a man who valued appearances over integrity, who traded loyalty for fleeting gains, who measured success by others' admiration rather than his own moral compass. The words struck the room like a physical blow, the air growing heavy with their weight. Richard's face paled, then flushed a deep, furious red, as if the accusation had drawn blood. Victoria's perfect facade cracked, her eyes darting to her husband with a mix of shock and dawning panic, her hand tightening on his arm as if to anchor him, or herself. Mr. Harrison pressed on, his tone as detached as if he were reading market reports rather than dismantling a man's legacy. He detailed Richard's treatment of me during our 34-year marriage, how I had supported his career, raised our children, managed our home, and stood by him through every storm. In return, Richard had lied, betrayed my trust, left me for a younger woman, and tried to rob me of my share of the life we'd built. My chest tightened as the words poured out, each one a mirror to the pain I'd carried, the betrayal I'd fought to overcome. Yet, hearing it laid bare brought a strange mix of vindication and sorrow, a reminder of the love I'd once poured into a marriage that ended in ashes. Richard tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with protest, but Mr. Harrison silenced him with a raised hand and continued. William's judgment grew sharper still. A man who couldn't honor his family, he wrote, couldn't be trusted with anything of true worth. A man who discarded a loyal wife like an obsolete possession didn't deserve to inherit the legacy of a lifetime sacrifice. The room fell silent, the only sounds the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant hum of traffic far below. Richard's breathing grew ragged, sharp gasps that betrayed his shock, like a man told he had months to live. Victoria's hand slid from his arm to grip the table's edge, her knuckles stark against her tanned skin, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity, as if she could force the attorney to undo the words. Mr. Harrison paused, taking a slow sip of water, the glass trembling faintly in his hand, the only sign he felt the gravity of what he was reading. Richard looked as if he might be sick, his confident exterior crumbling into something raw and broken. Victoria stared at the attorney, her gaze fierce, willing him to offer a reprieve. Inside, I wrestled with conflicting emotions, satisfaction that Richard's actions had consequences, but also a deep ache for the family we'd once been, now shattered beyond repair. I kept my expression neutral, but my heart twisted with the weight of it all. The attorney resumed, his voice slicing through the tension. Richard would receive nothing more. The $50,000 in personal effects were his entire share, a final lesson in the cost of disrespect and dishonesty. Richard surged to his feet, his chair skidding back and slamming against the wall. "This is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking with raw disbelief. "He can't do this. I'm his only son, his only heir. This has to be a mistake." His words trembled with rage and desperation, as if he could rewrite his father's will through sheer defiance. Mr. Harrison met his outburst with calm patience, as if he'd expected it. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your shock," he said, "but there is no mistake. Your father was clear in his instructions and anticipated challenges. He provided detailed records of your financial recklessness over the past 3 years and sworn statements from witnesses about your treatment of your former wife. The evidence, Richard's debts, his extravagance, his betrayal, hung in the air like a noose." Victoria spoke up, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "This is outrageous," she said, her polished tone fraying. "William wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this. No father would cut off his only son over a divorce. There has to be a way to contest this." Her words were a desperate plea, her eyes searching for any sign of weakness in the attorney's resolve. Mr. Clean, who had been silent by the window, stepped forward. Mrs. Blackwood, I assure you Mr. William Blackwood was fully competent, he said firmly. We have certifications from 2 independent physicians confirming his mental clarity, and he consulted 3 law firms to ensure his wishes were legally unassailable. His words left no room for argument, and Victoria's expression hardened, her hope fading like a candle snuffed out. Richard collapsed back into his chair, the fire gone from him. The man who had strode into the room with the confidence of a king now looked lost, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped. "What about the business?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The properties? Everything he built? It can't just vanish." The question was fragile, a last plea for something to hold on to. Mr. Harrison glanced at his papers, then looked up, his eyes finding mine across the room. "That brings us to the remainder of the estate," he said. "Your father was explicit about his wishes." He paused, and every gaze in the room turned to me, heavy with expectation. The entirety of the William James Blackwood's estate, business holdings, real estate, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, valued at approximately $15.2 million, is to be distributed to Eleanor Marie Blackwood. The words crashed over me like a wave, upending everything I thought I knew. The room seemed to spin, gravity itself faltering as I struggled to grasp the magnitude of what I'd heard. $15.2 million to me, Eleanor, the woman who had spent decades as a devoted wife and mother, who had never chased wealth or status, only love and respect. Every eye was on me, but my mind was a storm, unable to anchor itself to the reality of the moment. Richard's voice broke the silence, a hoarse whisper. "Eleanor." He left everything to Eleanor. He shook his head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. "She's not even family anymore. She's my ex-wife. She signed away her claim to my inheritance. She has no right to his money." His words dripped with disbelief and bitterness, as if I had somehow stolen what was rightfully his. Mr. Harrison's expression softened, almost pitying. "Mr. Blackwood, your former wife signed away her claim to assets you might inherit," he said. "She made no such agreement regarding assets left directly to her. Your father was free to choose his beneficiary, and he chose Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood." He turned back to the document, his voice steady. He was clear about his reasoning. My hands shook as he continued. "William praised my dignity, my loyalty, my grace in the face of betrayal that would have broken others. For 34 years, I had supported Richard, asking only for respect in return. When he abandoned me, I had carried myself with strength, refusing to let his actions define me. The words were a salve to old wounds, but they also brought a fresh wave of grief, for the love we'd lost, for the family we might have been, for the man William had hoped his son would become. The room was heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint perfume of Victoria's designer handbag, but all I could feel was the weight of William's words, scrawled in his meticulous hand, now read aloud by Mr. Harrison, the attorney whose voice carried the gravity of a man accustomed to unraveling lives. My chest tightened as tears slipped down my cheeks, unbidden and unchecked, tracing paths I didn't bother to wipe away. William's letter was a revelation, a kindness so unexpected it pierced through years of neglect, sharper than any tenderness I'd ever known from him in life. To hear him describe my choice to walk away from a bitter divorce battle, not as weakness, but as a quiet strength, stirred something deep inside me, a flicker of pride I hadn't felt in decades. I'd chosen dignity over a fight that would have lined the pockets of lawyers while tearing open old wounds. And now here was William, a man I'd always thought saw me as little more than an accessory to his son, acknowledging that choice as something rare, something worthy. The words sank into me, heavy with meaning. I'd spent years believing I was invisible, a woman who'd faded into the background of her own life, discarded when she no longer served a purpose. Yet William had seen me, not the shadow of a wife, but a person with a spine forged in quiet resolve. My hands trembled in my lap, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had noticed, someone had cared enough to rewrite my story. I sat there, a 60-year-old woman in a modest sweater, feeling the weight of a life I'd thought was behind me suddenly shift into something new, something possible. Across the table, Victoria's composure shattered like fine crystal dropped on marble. Her face, usually a mask of practiced elegance, twisted with fury. "This is insane," she shrieked, her voice slicing through the room's stillness. "She's nobody, just some pathetic old woman who couldn't keep her husband." Her words were venom, each one aimed to wound, to reduce me to the nothing she believed I was. I could see the panic in her eyes, the desperation of a woman who had built her life on the promise of wealth she assumed was hers. "William must have lost his mind when he wrote this," she continued, her voice rising. "We'll contest it. We'll drag this through every court until she doesn't see a single cent." Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if she could will the will itself to bend. Mr. Harrison, unfazed, set his papers down with the calm precision of a man who'd weathered countless storms like this one. His eyes, sharp and steady, met Victoria's. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his tone cool, but not unkind, "you are welcome to pursue legal action if you believe you have a case. But I must inform you that Mr. William Blackwood foresaw such a reaction and took every precaution to ensure his wishes are ironclad. The estate has more than enough resources to defend itself, and frankly, you have no legal standing to challenge a will in which you are not named." His words were a quiet hammer, striking down her outburst with the finality of truth. Victoria's face flushed, her lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. She was a woman used to getting her way, and now she stood on the precipice of losing everything she'd planned for. Richard, my ex-husband, sat beside her, his face pale, his breaths shallow and ragged. He looked like a man drowning, grasping for a lifeline that wasn't there. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a mix of desperation and disbelief. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling, "you can't seriously accept this. This is my father's money, my family's money. You know this isn't right. There's been some mistake, some misunderstanding." His words gained strength as he spoke, as if he could convince himself that this was all a clerical error, a glitch in the universe he could fix. "We can work this out, just you and me. No lawyers. We can come to a reasonable arrangement." His plea was raw, exposing the man who'd once shared my bed, my life, now reduced to begging for scraps of a fortune he'd assumed was his birthright. I looked at him, this man who'd discarded me after 34 years, who'd treated me like a worn-out piece of furniture when I no longer fit his vision of a perfect life. My heart ached, not for him, but for the woman I'd been, the one who'd believed love could be enough. I found my voice, steady despite the storm inside me. "Richard," I said softly, "your father was crystal clear about his intentions. This isn't a mistake. This is exactly what he wanted." I stood, my legs shaky but holding me upright, a small victory in itself. Turning to Mr. Harrison, I asked, "What do I need to do to accept this inheritance?" The attorney's face softened, a rare smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Blackwood, there are several documents to sign and procedures to complete, but we can handle those in the coming days. For now, you simply need to confirm that you accept the bequest as outlined in Mr. William Blackwood's will." His voice was kind, almost encouraging, as if he too saw something in me that I was only beginning to recognize. "I accept," I said, the words ringing out with a clarity that surprised even me. "I accept the inheritance, and I will do my best to honor William's trust in me." The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard let out a sound, half groan, half sob, his shoulders slumping as the reality settled over him. Victoria, her face a mask of fury, grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble floor. She didn't look back, her exit a silent declaration of war. Richard lingered, his eyes pleading one last time. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice breaking. "You can't do this to me, to us. We'll lose everything, the house, the wedding, all our plans. Victoria's pregnant. We need this money." His desperation was palpable, a man unraveling before my eyes. I looked at him across the conference table, this stranger who'd once been my everything, and felt a quiet resolve settle over me. "Richard," I said gently, "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself. Your father saw how you treated me, how you threw me away when I was no longer useful. He decided that a man who could do that to his wife didn't deserve the fortune he'd built. This isn't about revenge. It's about consequences. My words were calm, but they carried the weight of 34 years of unspoken truths. Richard stared at me, his face cycling through anger, disbelief, and something softer, perhaps the dawning of regret. He nodded once, a small, defeated gesture, and walked toward the door. Just before he left, he turned back. "I guess I never really knew you, did I, Eleanor?" His voice was quiet, not accusing, just heavy with the realization of a life misjudged. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "You never did." He walked out, leaving me alone with Mr. Harrison, the court reporter, and the weight of a future I'd never imagined. The attorney began gathering his papers, but he paused, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that felt genuine. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Your former father-in-law was a complex man, not always likable, but he had a keen eye for character. I think he'd be proud of how you handled yourself today." I thanked him, my mind already spinning with the next steps, meetings with accountants, financial advisors, decisions about William's sprawling business interests. It was daunting, but beneath the overwhelm was a spark of excitement. For the first time in my adult life, I had choices, real choices, about how to live, how to spend my time, how to make a difference. As I left the conference room and stepped into the elevator, I thought of William's last words to me at his birthday party 3 years ago. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. He'd been planting a seed, a quiet promise that had taken years to bloom into this moment, a $15 million chance to start over. The elevator doors closed, and I descended back to the street, back to my quiet life in Salem, my small house, my garden, my part-time job at the library. But everything had changed. I was no longer the discarded wife, too proud or too stubborn to fight for scraps. I was Eleanor Blackwood, inheritor of a fortune, a woman with the power to shape her own future. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight pierced the clouds as I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel, not ready to drive, letting the enormity of the day settle over me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your inheritance. I hope you'll be very happy. Victoria." The words dripped with sarcasm, a final jab from a woman who'd lost her grip on the prize. I deleted it without replying. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with possibilities. William had trusted me to use his wealth wisely, and I intended to honor that trust. There would be time for travel, for experiences I'd never dreamed of affording, for a life Richard had once mocked me for not being sophisticated enough to live. But first, there were bigger things, people to help, causes to support, ways to make a mark that went beyond my own comfort. I thought of my garden, its lessons etched into my soul. The most unlikely plants could thrive with the right care, the seemingly dead could simply be dormant, waiting for their season. Sometimes, the most beautiful flowers grew from the darkest soil. By the time I reached Salem, plans were taking shape in my mind. The next morning I woke in my familiar bed, half expecting the inheritance to be a dream. But Mr. Harrison's business card sat on my nightstand, and my phone showed 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. Word of the will had leaked, and the local media had latched onto the story of a spurned ex-wife inheriting millions. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, gazing at my garden, its quiet beauty a reminder of resilience. I wasn't sure how to navigate this new life, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to try it out. The incessant ringing of the phone pierced the quiet of my modest Salem home, each call a reminder of the whirlwind that had upended my life. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver, unsure if I could handle another intrusion. Finally, I picked up. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, introducing herself as Jessica Chen from the Portland Tribune. Her words were polite but probing, asking if I'd be willing to share my story, the unexpected inheritance, my ties to the Blackwood family, the weight of it all. My throat tightened. The idea of baring my soul to a stranger, of turning my private upheaval into public fodder, felt like a betrayal of the quiet life I'd carved out. I declined with as much courtesy as I could muster and hung up, my heart racing. But the phone rang again, almost instantly, as if mocking my attempt to retreat. This time it was a television producer, her questions echoing Jessica's, her tone eager for a soundbite. I realized then that silence wouldn't stop the world from knocking. I turned off the phone, the sudden quiet a small victory, and escaped to my garden. The November air was sharp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. My flower beds, now dormant for winter, stretched out before me, their bare soil a mirror to my own uncertainty. I wandered among them, my boots sinking slightly into the cold ground, trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. $15 million. The number felt like a phantom, intangible, like Monopoly money scattered across a game board. But the reality was heavier. Properties, businesses, responsibilities that demanded decisions I wasn't sure I was ready to make. My mind churned, caught between awe and dread. For so long, my life had been defined by others' needs, my parents, my ex-husband Richard, our children, the endless rhythm of maintaining a home. Now at 62, I was being asked to define myself, and the freedom was as daunting as it was exhilarating. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, appeared at the wooden fence dividing our yards, a steaming cup of tea in her hands and curiosity flickering in her eyes. She'd seen the reporters skulking around my house that morning, their cameras and notepads like vultures circling. Her expression was gentle but eager, the kind of look that carried 1,000 unasked questions. "Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, "I couldn't help but notice some unusual visitors today. Is everything all right?" I sighed, the weight of the truth pressing against my chest, and gave her the short version, the inheritance, the Blackwood estate, the fortune that had landed in my lap. Her eyes widened, her tea forgotten as she absorbed each detail. Mrs. Chen had known Richard during our marriage, had watched the slow unraveling of our life together, the divorce that left me raw and rebuilding. She'd seen the way he dismissed me, belittled me, and her quiet sympathy over the years had been a small anchor. Now as I spoke, I could see her piecing it together, her mind turning over the justice of it all. "Well," she said after a long pause, sipping her tea thoughtfully, "I always thought Richard's father had a way of seeing through people. He knew what kind of man his son was. And you, Eleanor, you've earned this after everything you've endured." Her words were warm, but they carried a weight that made my chest ache. She knew the years I'd spent swallowing my own dreams to prop up Richard's, the quiet humiliations I'd borne. Her question came gently, almost hesitantly. "What will you do now?" It was a simple question, but it unraveled me. What would I do? For decades, my life had been a series of obligations, each choice shaped by someone else's needs. Now the canvas was blank, and the vastness of it was overwhelming. I told her I needed time to think, to let the shock settle, to chart a path forward. She nodded, her eyes kind, and retreated to her house. But I caught her glancing back through her kitchen window, watching me as I knelt among my flower beds, lost in thought. Salem was a small town, and news traveled like wildfire. By evening, I knew whispers of my inheritance would be on every tongue, carried from neighbor to neighbor like a shared secret. The days that followed were a blur of chaos, phone calls, meetings, stacks of paperwork that seemed to multiply by the hour. Mr. Harrison, the estate's executor, introduced me to a team of financial advisors, their suits crisp and their language a maze of numbers, percentages, and projections. They laid out the scope of the inheritance: commercial real estate in Portland and Seattle, a stock portfolio that seemed to grow as I blinked, municipal bonds, a manufacturing company producing specialized construction hardware, and a web of other business interests that hummed with steady income. Each asset was a thread in a tapestry I could barely comprehend, a legacy that demanded I step into a role I'd never imagined for myself. The most breathtaking revelation came when they told me about the house. Tucked in the hills above Portland, it was a sprawling contemporary masterpiece William Blackwood had owned for 15 years but rarely used. Carol Martinez, the property manager, met me there, her efficiency a stark contrast to my own disorientation. As we walked through the house, I felt like an intruder in a world I didn't belong to. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed panoramic views of Portland's skyline and Mount Hood's majestic peak, the city sprawling below like a living map. The rooms were vast, larger than my entire Salem home, filled with tasteful furniture and artwork that belonged in galleries. The kitchen gleamed with appliances that could have starred in a chef's wildest dreams. Carol's voice was steady as she explained, Mr. Blackwood used this as a retreat, a place to escape the noise of his world. He'd come here to think, to find clarity. We paused in the living room where a massive stone fireplace anchored the space, and the windows turned the view into a living painting. He left explicit instructions, Carol continued, that you should use this house whenever you wish, for as long as you wish. Standing there gazing out at a view that felt like it cost more than a lifetime's earnings, I was overwhelmed. Gratitude, disbelief, and a strange grief washed over me. William hadn't just left me his wealth, he'd given me a sanctuary, a place that whispered a possibility of a life I'd never dared imagine. Richard had always insisted I was too simple, too small town, to belong in such a world. Yet here I was, standing in a home that proved him wrong, a gift from a man who'd seen my worth when his own son hadn't. That evening, I drove back to Salem, the contrast between the mansion and my cozy, familiar house jarring. I sat in my kitchen, where I'd cooked countless meals over the years, and tried to reconcile the woman I'd been that afternoon, touring a mansion, with the one who'd lived in this modest space. The choice was mine now. I could stay in Salem, live quietly on the income from the investments, or step into the vast unknown this inheritance offered. The freedom was dizzying, a liberation I hadn't known I craved. Then Richard called, his voice tightly controlled, but laced with a desperation I could feel through the phone. Was the first I'd heard from him since the will reading. He asked to meet for coffee, just to talk, to see if we could work things out. Against the quiet voice of caution in my head, I agreed. We met at a small cafe in downtown Salem, a place that held faded memories of breakfast from the early days of our marriage, when love still felt possible. Richard looked like a shadow of himself, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He ordered coffee but left it untouched, his fingers fidgeting with the cup's handle as he searched for words. Eleanor, he started, his voice low, I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know I hurt you, treated you in ways I can't undo. His admission hung between us, heavy with the weight of decades, years of dismissals, betrayals, the slow erosion of who I'd been. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Victoria's pregnant. We're having a baby. My father always wanted grandchildren. If he'd known, he would have made different choices. I looked at him, this man who'd once been my world, who'd fathered our children, shared my life for over 30 years, and felt only a quiet sadness. His fall was his own making, but he couldn't see it. Richard, I said softly, your father knew exactly what he was doing. He saw you walk away from your family for a younger woman. He chose not to reward that. His face tightened, and he pressed on, his voice rising with desperation. But the baby, Eleanor, you wouldn't punish an innocent child for my mistakes, would you? Victoria and I, we made plans, bought a house we can't afford, took on debts, we're drowning. Without some of that inheritance, we'll lose everything. I thought of the Portland house, its sweeping views and quiet elegance. I thought of the businesses generating income, the investments growing steadily, a future I could shape. Richard was asking me to carve out a piece of that future to prop up the life he'd built on assumptions, on the belief that his father's wealth would always save him. Richard, I said, my voice steady, you made your choices. You left our marriage. You spent money you didn't have. You built a life on expectations, not reality. Those were your decisions, and now you have to live with them. I stood to leave, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight with panic. Eleanor, please, I'm begging you. Just $1 million. It'd solve everything. You'd still have 14 million left. You could afford to be generous. His voice cracked and the raw desperation in it stung, but it also sparked a quiet anger. Even now, pleading for my help, he was trying to dictate what I should do, as if my choices were still his to shape. I stood in the dimly lit cafe, the faint hum of conversation and clinking coffee cups fading into the background as Richard's voice grated against my nerves. His hand, firm yet pleading, gripped my arm as he tried to lecture me about my money, as if he still had any claim to it, my inheritance, my future, my freedom. I could feel the weight of his expectations, the same ones that had once confined me to a life I never chose. "Richard," I said, my voice steady but laced with a quiet fury, yanking my arm free from his grasp. "This conversation is done. The inheritance is mine, and I'm keeping it. You made your choice when you decided I wasn't enough for your shiny new life. Now you get to live with it." My words hung in the air, sharp and final, as I turned and walked out, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I didn't look back, but I could feel his stare burning into me, following me all the way to my car parked under the gray Oregon sky. His gaze was heavy with resentment, maybe regret, but I didn't care to decipher it. I was done carrying his baggage. That night, alone in my small Salem apartment, I sat on the edge of my couch, the phone pressed to my ear as I dialed Carol Martinez. My voice was calm but resolute as I asked about the Portland house. William's house, now mine. Was it available for an extended stay? Carol's warm tone reassured me it was, promising to have it ready for my arrival. Her words felt like the first step towards something new, something bigger than the life I'd been living. The next day I began packing, not just for a trip, but for a transformation. Salem had been my home for 3 years, but it was never truly mine. It was a compromise, a shadow of the life I'd wanted, shaped by the ruins Richard left behind when he stripped away my choices. As I folded my clothes, enough to fit into 2 modest suitcases, I confronted the stark reality of how small my world had become. My books, the ones that had been my refuge, filled 3 cardboard boxes. My mementos, photographs, a few trinkets, a handful of letters, barely took up a single crate. 3 years of solitude, and I had so little to show for it. No deep connections, no lasting impact. Just a functional existence that kept me afloat, but never let me soar. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, came by that evening, her arms cradling a plate of homemade cookies, her eyes glistening with tears. She was a kind woman, one of the few who'd made Salem bearable with her quiet gestures of care. "I'm going to miss you terribly, Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling as she set the plate on my kitchen counter. "But I'm so happy for you. You're finally getting the chance to live the life you deserve." Her hug was warm, fierce, and grounding, and as she pulled back, she whispered, "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for this gift. You've earned it." Her words sank deep, stirring something in me, a resolve to embrace this new chapter without apology. I hugged her back, my throat tight with gratitude, and promised to keep in touch. The drive to Portland was like crossing an invisible threshold, a bridge between the woman I'd been and the one I was becoming. Behind me lay Eleanor Blackwood, the quiet divorcee who worked part-time at the Salem Library, tending a modest garden to fill the empty hours. Ahead was Eleanor Blackwood, one of Oregon's wealthiest women, stepping into a life of properties and businesses I was only beginning to comprehend. The Portland house greeted me at sunset, its massive windows glowing with golden light that spilled across the city below. It was breathtaking, a mansion that felt more like a dream than a home. Carol had prepared the master suite, a sanctuary with a fireplace that crackled softly, a balcony overlooking a sprawling garden, and a bathroom larger than my entire Salem kitchen. But it was the closet that stopped me in my tracks. I laughed out loud, a sound that felt foreign after years of restraint. The closet was a cathedral of space, shelves, drawers, and Raymondine racks designed for a wardrobe that belonged to a $15 million life, not the faded jeans and cardigans I'd brought with me. Standing there surrounded by empty hangers, I felt a flicker of possibility, a chance to redefine myself. That night I sat on the balcony, a glass of wine from William's exquisite collection in hand, the city lights twinkling below like stars scattered across the horizon. My mind churned with questions about the future. The financial advisors had laid out a detailed report on the estate, assets, investments, income streams that promised more money than I could ever spend. Even if I indulged every whim, I could travel the world, buy anything I desired, live anywhere I chose, and still end each year wealthier than I began. But as I sipped the wine, its rich notes lingering on my tongue, I realized money was just a tool. The real challenge was deciding what I wanted to build with it. For the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom to choose my path, and the weight of that freedom was both thrilling and daunting. I felt like a bird released from a cage, unsure if my wings could still carry me. Over the next few weeks, I began to shape my new life. I hired a personal shopper, not out of vanity, but necessity. If I was going to navigate this world of wealth, I needed to look the part, not for myself, but to be taken seriously by those who judged based on appearances. My new wardrobe was sleek, tailored, a far cry from the practical clothes I'd worn in Salem. I enrolled in a financial literacy course at Portland State University, determined to master the intricacies of my inheritance rather than leaving it in the hands of advisors. Knowledge was power, and I refused to be a passive bystander in my own life. Most importantly, I explored Portland, seeking ways to use my resources for something meaningful. I visited homeless shelters, food banks, literacy programs, and organizations supporting survivors of domestic violence. I attended charity galas and fundraisers, watching how the wealthy wielded their resources, some with genuine care, others with performative flair. It was at one such event, a fundraiser for a women's shelter, that I met Dr. Sarah Martinez, a social worker whose passion for her work radiated like a beacon. Over dinner after the fundraiser, Sarah spoke with a fire that captivated me. She described the women who came to her shelter, women with no money, no job skills, no safe place to go. They needed more than a bed and a meal. They needed education, training, childcare, and counseling to rebuild their lives. "We know what works," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. "We know how to help these women succeed, but we're always scraping by, piecing together grants and donations. We can give them shelter, but we can't give them a future." Her words hit me hard, stirring memories of my own vulnerability 3 years ago, when I'd been at Richard's mercy during our divorce. I'd been lucky, half a house, enough savings to scrape by. But what if I hadn't? What if I'd been trapped, with no options, no way out? That night, as I lay in the vast master suite, Sarah's words echoed in my mind, planting the seed of an idea that felt bigger than myself. The next morning, I called Sarah and invited her to lunch. Over soup and sandwiches at a quiet restaurant near the university, I shared my vision. I wanted to fund a comprehensive program for women escaping abusive relationships, not just a shelter, but a lifeline. A program that offered job training, education, childcare, counseling, and transitional housing. A path from crisis to independence, giving women the tools to build lives of their own. As I spoke, I saw Sarah's eyes light up, her excitement mirroring my own. "Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "this could be revolutionary. It could change hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. But it's a massive undertaking, facilities, staff, ongoing costs. We're talking millions of dollars and years of work." I leaned forward, my heart pounding with purpose. "I have millions, Sarah, and I have years to give to something that matters. The question is, do you think it's possible? Would you help me make it real?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Eleanor, I've dreamed of this my entire career. I've begged for funding, pitched to foundations, and gotten nowhere. If you're serious, I'm all in." We spent the next 3 hours sketching out ideas, facilities, programs, potential locations. By the time we parted, I'd committed to funding a feasibility study and hiring Sarah as a consultant to develop a full proposal. In the months that followed, our lunch conversation grew into a concrete plan. We assembled a team, architects to design facilities, educators to craft training programs, financial advisors to structure funding, and lawyers to navigate the legal framework. We traveled to other cities, studying similar programs, learning from their successes and missteps. The project became my life's heartbeat, filling my days with purpose and my dreams with possibility. I had found something worthy of William's legacy, a way to use his fortune to create lasting change. But as the program took shape, I began to notice eyes on me, curious, calculating, some familiar, some not. My new life was drawing attention, and not all of it felt welcome. 6 months after the reading of William's will, Richard's name flashed across my phone screen again. It was March, and the chill of early spring seemed to seep into his voice, though it carried a new edge. Not the raw desperation of before, but something sharper, more calculated, like a man carefully laying out a chessboard. He mentioned my work with the Women's Shelter Project. his tone warm with praise that felt rehearsed. "Eleanor, I've been reading about your foundation," he said, the words smooth but heavy with intent. "It's inspiring, truly. The way you're using the money, it's generous, admirable. I'm proud of you." The sincerity in his voice was almost convincing, but beneath it, I caught a faint undercurrent of opportunism, like a salesman gauging his mark. My guard went up instantly. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, my tone measured, each word chosen with care. "It's work that matters deeply to me, and I'm grateful for the chance to support it." I kept my voice steady, unwilling to give him an inch. He pressed on, undeterred, his pitch unfolding like a script he'd practiced too many times. "I was thinking," he said, "you're managing something massive here, a real undertaking. Victoria's been working with some top-tier nonprofits through her art business. She's got connections, people who could help you stretch your donations further, make an even bigger impact." The suggestion was so transparent it nearly made me laugh aloud. Richard, ever the strategist, trying to wedge himself and his new wife into the life I'd built without him. It was bold, almost absurdly so. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice polite but firm, "I appreciate the offer, but I've got an excellent team of advisors already. I'm well covered." My words were a wall, and I could sense his frustration through the phone as he scrambled to regroup. Of course," he said quickly, his tone shifting to something softer, more personal. "I just thought, given our history, our children, maybe we could find a way to work together on something good. It could be a chance to rebuild, to show the kids we can still be a family, even after everything." The mention of our children, grown adults with lives of their own, felt like a calculated jab, a lever he thought he could pull to pry open my defenses. It wasn't just transparent, it was low, even for him. My anger flared, a hot spark igniting in my chest where sadness might have lingered years ago. "Richard," I said, my voice sharper now, cutting through his pretense like a blade. "Our children don't need us to play happy family for their sake. They're adults, building their own lives, and they certainly don't need to see their father trying to manipulate their mother into sharing an inheritance he lost through his own choices." The words spilled out, fueled by a fury I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. His protest came quickly, almost panicked. "Eleanor, that's not what I'm doing," he insisted. But the lie was thin, and we both knew it. He tried to pivot, his voice softening again. "I just think it'd be better for everyone if we could move forward together, not apart." I felt my hands tighten around the phone, the anger steady now, like a fire that had found its fuel. "We moved forward separately the moment you chose divorce," I reminded him, my voice cold but steady. "You made it crystal clear you didn't want me in your new life. Well, you got your wish, Richard. You have your new wife, your new baby, your new world, and I have mine." I hung up before he could respond, my hands trembling, not from fear or grief, but from the raw force of my anger. Richard still saw me as a pawn, someone he could nudge and prod until he found the right angle to access the fortune he'd squandered. He hadn't learned a thing from his father's decision to cut him out, hadn't glimpsed the truth about why William had chosen me instead. He was still the same man, selfish, entitled, blind to the wreckage he'd left behind when he traded our 34-year marriage for a younger woman and a shinier life. But I wasn't the same woman he'd divorced. I wasn't the quiet, accommodating Eleanor who had spent decades bending to his will, accepting his judgment of my worth as if it were gospel. I was Eleanor Blackwood now, a woman with the resources and resolve to carve out a life of meaning, one that stood firm on my own terms. That phone call crystallized something for me. This new life wasn't just about wealth or the trappings that came with it, the elegant house, the fine clothes, the freedom to live well. It was about power, the kind that came from making choices rooted in my own values, not someone else's expectations. It was about taking the extraordinary gift William had given me and building something enduring, something that would outlast me and touch lives in ways I'd never dreamed possible. William had seen something in me that I'd only begun to recognize in myself. A strength, a capacity for responsibility that Richard had never valued. His inheritance wasn't just money, it was a challenge, a call to prove that his faith in me was justified. I felt the weight of that trust, not as a burden, but as a spark that drove me forward. I was determined to honor it, to show that I was worthy of the faith he'd placed in me. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I inherited William's fortune, I stood at the podium for the groundbreaking ceremony of the Eleanor Blackwood Center for Women's Independence. The air was sharp with autumn's bite, and the crowd before me buzzed with energy. Reporters, supporters, donors, and future residents, all gathered to witness what the media had dubbed the largest private investment in women's services in Oregon's history. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I felt a swell of pride that had little to do with the wealth behind it and everything to do with the lives this center would transform. Beside me stood Dr. Martinez, her eyes bright with the quiet triumph of seeing a dream she'd nurtured for years take root in reality. The center was more than a shelter. It was a lifeline, a place where up to 40 women and their children could find not just safety, but a path to a new life. The 18-month program we designed was comprehensive: job training, educational support, childcare, counseling, and transitional housing, all tailored to help women rebuild from the ground up. We had hired 23 full-time staff, social workers, career counselors, childcare specialists, and forged partnerships with local colleges and businesses to offer education and job placement. The building itself was a balance of function and warmth, a modern 3-story structure that felt like a home, not an institution. Private family units gave residents dignity and space, while communal areas for meals, meetings, and activities fostered connection. The children's spaces were vibrant, designed by experts with bright play areas and learning centers. The job training facilities were state-of-the-art: a commercial kitchen for culinary skills, a computer lab for office training, workshops for trades, each detail crafted to empower. As I spoke about the center's mission, my gaze swept the crowd and caught a familiar figure lingering near the parking lot, half hidden behind a news van. Richard. He stood alone. No Victoria, no baby, his face etched with lines that made him look older than his 58 years. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment, and I saw something in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or the weight of a chance forever lost. I couldn't be sure. I turned back to my speech, letting the moment pass, focusing on the hope and purpose in front of me. After the ceremony, as I mingled with supporters and fielded questions from reporters, Richard approached. He waited until the crowd thinned, his posture cautious, like a man stepping into territory he knew he didn't belong in. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice stripped of its earlier calculation. "Congratulations. What you've built here, it's remarkable." The words felt genuine, and for the first time I didn't sense an ulterior motive lurking beneath them. He went on, his voice low but steady. "I owe you an apology for how I've acted this past year. I know I've crossed lines, said things I shouldn't have. I understand now why my father made the choices he did." I studied his face, searching for the old signs of manipulation, but found only a quiet remorse that seemed, against all odds, sincere. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice softening but still cautious. "That means more than you know." He hesitated, then continued, his words barely audible over the fading hum of the crowd. "Victoria and I separated 3 months ago. The financial strain, the stress, it broke us. She took the baby and went back to California." He paused, his eyes distant, as if grappling with the weight of his own story. "I've had time to think about what I did. To you, to our marriage, to everything I threw away because I thought it wasn't enough." A pang of unexpected sadness hit me, not for the man he'd become, but for the one I'd once loved, the partner I'd built a life with before he chose to tear it apart. "I'm sorry to hear that, Richard," I said, meaning it. "I hope you and Victoria can find a way to do what's best for your child." His next words came like a confession, raw and unpolished. "The baby isn't mine," he said, the admission spilling out as if it had been clawing at him for weeks. "Victoria told me 3 weeks before she left. She'd been with someone else before we even met." The revelation hung between us, heavy and sharp. I felt a flicker of pity for him, this man who had lost so much, not just the inheritance, but the new life he'd gambled everything for. Yet even in that moment, I knew I couldn't let his pain pull me back into his orbit. I had my own path now, one I'd fought hard to forge, and I wasn't about to let it be dimmed by the shadow of his regrets. The truth about her child's paternity had always been a shadow in her heart, a secret she guarded with quiet unease. When the inheritance slipped through our fingers, when our finances crumbled into an unbearable mess, she chose that moment to lay everything bare. Her confession struck me like a fist to the chest, not because I still cared about Richard's tangled personal life, but because the weight of what it meant crashed over me. Richard had torched our marriage, walked away from his family's wealth, and severed ties with his children, all for a woman who had woven a web of lies from the very start. The irony was almost too sharp, too poetic, as if the universe had scripted his downfall with a cruel sense of justice. I looked at him, his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too many regrets. "Richard," I said softly, my voice steadier than I felt, "I don't know what to say. That must have torn you apart." And I meant it. Despite the wreckage he'd left in my life, the betrayal, the cold dismissal of everything we'd built together, the pain that had once kept me awake at night, I couldn't summon any joy in his suffering. My heart, bruised as it was, refused to revel in his despair. He nodded, his eyes distant, as if he were staring at some version of himself he barely recognized. "It was devastating," he admitted, his voice low and raw. "But it was also like a fog lifting. I've spent years chasing things that didn't matter, trying to be someone I'm not, running after some hollow idea of success, of being polished and important. None of it was me." He glanced past me, his gaze settling on the community center behind us, its windows catching the warm glow of the afternoon sun. "What you've created here, Eleanor, this is real. This is the kind of work that leaves a mark, the kind of legacy that actually means something." His words hung in the air, heavy with a sincerity I hadn't heard from him in years. For a moment we stood there, two people who had once shared a life but now lived in entirely separate universes. The silence between us wasn't hostile, but it was thick with the weight of everything unsaid, everything irreparable. Then Richard extended his hand, a gesture that felt both formal and final. "I hope you find happiness, Eleanor. You deserve every good thing coming your way." I took his hand, my fingers closing around his briefly, feeling the end of something I couldn't quite name. "I hope you find your way to a better place too, Richard," I said, my voice steady but tinged with a quiet sadness. "Everyone deserves a chance to start again." He gave a small nod, turned and walked toward the parking lot, his shoulders slightly hunched, his steps deliberate. I watched him go, not with anger or triumph, but with a deep, aching sorrow for how easily people can lose themselves chasing dreams that were never theirs to begin with. The months after the center opened were some of the richest, most purposeful of my life. I didn't just fund the place from afar. I poured myself into it, spending days each week immersed in its programs. I taught financial literacy classes, drawing on the hard-won lessons I'd learned about budgeting, investing, and navigating the precarious edges of financial ruin. Every mistake I'd made, every sleepless night spent worrying over bills, became a story I could share to help others avoid the same pitfalls. I worked closely with career counselors, leveraging my old business contacts to build job placement pipelines for our graduates. But the heart of my work was the time I spent with the women themselves, listening to their stories, offering encouragement, and standing as proof that a life could be rebuilt, no matter how shattered it seemed. Many of them were stunned to learn that I, the woman who'd funded their lifeline, had walked a path not so different from theirs. I'd survived a divorce that left me financially adrift, emotionally gutted, and questioning my own worth. Sharing that truth wasn't easy. It meant peeling back the polished exterior I'd worn for years. But it was worth it to see the spark of hope in their eyes, to watch them realize that their struggles didn't define their futures. With the right tools and support, they could carve out new lives for themselves and their children, lives filled with possibility. One woman, Maria Santos, left an indelible mark on me. At 34, she was a mother of two who'd escaped an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes she wore and a fierce resolve to protect her kids. Maria was sharp, driven, but life had never given her a chance to shine. Her husband had controlled every penny, barring her from working or even touching their bank accounts. When she arrived at the center, her eyes held a mix of fear and defiance, as if she were daring the world to break her again. But she threw herself into our programs with a hunger that inspired everyone around her. She soaked up our computer training course, attended every financial literacy session, and even volunteered to watch other residents' children when she wasn't in class. Within 6 months, she'd earned certifications in office administration and bookkeeping, landing a job as an assistant manager at a local accounting firm. Maria's transformation went far beyond skills or paychecks. She rediscovered her confidence, her sense of worth, her belief that she deserved respect and dignity. She became a beacon for newer residents, sharing her story with a quiet strength that made others feel less alone. Watching her evolve from a woman haunted by fear to a self-assured professional was more rewarding than any deal I'd ever closed, any milestone I'd ever hit in my old life. Her success wasn't just hers. It was a victory for her children, for the community, for every woman who'd ever doubted her own resilience. The center's impact rippled outward, catching the attention of other cities and organizations eager to replicate our model. Invitations poured in to speak at conferences on innovative solutions for domestic violence and homelessness. Researchers wanted to study our outcomes. Government officials visited to explore how our practices could shape public policy, and nonprofits from across the country proposed partnerships. The recognition was humbling, but it also brought new challenges. A coalition in Seattle asked me to fund a similar center in their city. A San Francisco group pitched a program for women aging out of foster care. A Denver nonprofit wanted to adapt our model for rural areas, where isolation and scarce resources made recovery even harder. Each proposal represented countless lives that could be changed, but also demanded significant resources and a leap in my philanthropic reach. I found myself grappling with choices I'd never anticipated, deciding which causes to prioritize, how to stretch finite resources across infinite needs. It forced me to think strategically, to build a framework for my giving. I assembled a team of experts to vet proposals, evaluate partners, and track program impact. I formalized my efforts through the Blackwood Foundation, a professional entity with clear processes for grants and oversight. The work was intellectually exhilarating, pushing me to learn about social policy, nonprofit management, and impact measurement. I enrolled in university courses, hired tutors to decode dense research papers, and traveled to study successful programs nationwide. For the first time, my mind felt fully alive, engaged in a way that was both challenging and deeply fulfilling. But the true reward was in the stories that kept coming. Every month, I heard from women who'd graduated from our programs and were thriving. Maria sent updates about her career and her kids' school successes. Jennifer Walsh, a former teacher who'd been homeless after escaping abuse, now coordinated a literacy program. Carmen Rodriguez launched a catering business after our culinary training. These weren't just feel-good moments. They were proof of families transformed, of children growing up with strong, independent mothers, of communities enriched by their contributions. The ripple effects of our work stretched far beyond the women we served. As the foundation's reputation grew, I connected with other philanthropists and social entrepreneurs tackling similar challenges. I found a community of givers who shared ideas, partnered on projects, and amplified each other's impact. These relationships broadened my view of social change, showing me how different approaches could interlock. One conversation with David Chen, a tech entrepreneur funding education, sparked an idea for a partnership. His program offered scholarships and mentoring for first-generation college students, and he saw potential in linking it with our work, creating a pipeline of opportunity for women escaping domestic violence. It was a vision of change that felt expansive, interconnected, and full of promise. Over a candlelit dinner in my Portland home, the conversation with a colleague took an inspiring turn. Eleanor, he began, his voice warm with curiosity, I've been diving into your work at the Women's Center, and I'm captivated by how you've tackled the economic chains that bind women to abusive situations. It's got me thinking, could we prevent some of these cycles by equipping young women with education and financial opportunities before they're preyed upon? His words ignited a spark deep within me, a vision of not just healing wounds, but stopping them from being inflicted in the first place. That evening, as we lingered over coffee, we began sketching out a bold new chapter for our foundation, a program to empower young women who had aged out of foster care or grown up in homes scarred by domestic violence. The idea was to provide college scholarships and career mentorship, giving them the tools to build lives of independence and resilience, free from the economic traps that so often led to toxic relationships. This shift toward prevention demanded a fresh approach, distinct from our residential services. It wasn't about offering immediate shelter, but fostering long-term relationships. Mentors who would guide these women through college, job interviews, in the early years of their careers. The emotional weight of this work struck me profoundly. I imagined the fear and uncertainty these young women carried, the way poverty and trauma could whisper doubts into their hearts. Our goal was to replace those whispers with voices of encouragement, to show them they could author their own futures. The theoretical backbone remained unchanged: empower women with the resources to shape their destinies. Yet as I pored over the program designs, I felt a growing sense of responsibility, a quiet thrill at the thought that we could rewrite countless stories before they turned tragic. As the foundation's reach expanded, my world did too. I found myself crisscrossing the globe, visiting programs and speaking at conferences. Each trip was a revelation, peeling back layers of how poverty, violence, and discrimination wove through women's lives. In Guatemala, I sat with women in cooperatives, their hands weaving vibrant textiles as they shared stories of reclaiming their dignity through collective work. In Bangladesh, I saw microfinance programs ignite sparks of entrepreneurship in women who had once felt invisible. In rural Mississippi, I watched young girls light up at educational initiatives that promised futures beyond their small towns. These experiences reshaped me, deepening my empathy and fueling my determination. Yet, they also left me humbled, acutely aware of how interconnected our struggles were, how a single act of support could ripple across lives. But it was in Washington, D.C., during a conference on nonprofit innovation, that the past came knocking. I was dining alone at a restaurant near my hotel, savoring a moment of quiet reflection, when a familiar figure caught my eye across the room. Victoria Sterling, Richard's ex-wife, sat at a table with a man I didn't know. Her blonde hair was styled differently, softer than the polished look I remembered from the tense will reading years ago. Her demeanor was quieter, almost fragile, a far cry from the confident woman who had once radiated ambition. Our eyes locked and time seemed to pause. I felt a jolt of unease, memories of betrayal and bitterness stirring. Then hesitantly, she rose and approached my table. "Eleanor," she said, her voice tentative, almost pleading, "I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say hello and to apologize for how I acted at the will reading." I was reeling, angry, and I lashed out in ways that were cruel and unfair. Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I gestured for her to sit, curiosity outweighing my guardedness. "Thank you, Victoria," I replied softly. That day was hard for all of us. As she settled into the chair, I studied her. She looked older, not just in years, but in the way life's weight had etched itself into her face. Yet there was still a beauty to her, the kind that wealth and genetics could preserve, though it now seemed tempered by vulnerability. She spoke again, her voice steadier. "I've followed your work with the foundation, and I'm in awe of what you've built. Richard was wrong about so many things, but especially about you. You've turned that inheritance into something extraordinary." Her words stirred a mix of emotions, pride, but also a flicker of pain at the mention of Richard. We talked for nearly an hour, and as she opened up, I glimpsed the unraveling of her life since her marriage to Richard ended. She had moved to California to be near her family, raising her daughter alone while trying to revive her art dealing business, which had crumbled under the financial fallout of her divorce. Her honesty was raw, almost disarming. "I made so many mistakes," she admitted, her eyes distant. "Greed and ambition blinded me. I thought marrying Richard would unlock a life of luxury I couldn't afford on my own. I never stopped to ask if we were truly compatible, if we could build something real beyond money." Her confession stirred unexpected sympathy in me. I saw a woman who, like Richard, had chased a hollow dream of success, only to find herself emptier than before. "The irony," she continued, a wry smile flickering, "is that watching what you've done with that money has taught me more about true wealth than my years in the art world ever did. You've created something lasting, something that changes lives. That's a success I never grasped until now." Her words lingered, and I felt a quiet connection forming, not of friendship, but of shared understanding. Two women shaped by the same man's choices, yet forging wildly different paths. As we parted, Victoria handed me her business card. "I'm working with some California nonprofits on art therapy programs for trauma survivors," she said. "If your foundation ever wants to explore creative programming, I'd love to help. I can't erase the harm I caused, but maybe I can use my skills for something more than profit." Her offer felt genuine, a small step toward redemption. I tucked the card into my purse, promising to keep in touch, though I wasn't sure if I would. The encounter haunted me for weeks, a vivid reminder of how the events of 3 years ago had reshaped not just my life, but everyone's. Richard had lost his inheritance, his marriage, his children's trust. Victoria had lost her financial security in her illusions about success. Yet both seemed to be groping towards something better, learning from the wreckage. Their struggles threw my own journey into sharp relief. William's gift had been more than money. It had been a chance to unearth parts of myself I'd buried during my marriage. The timid wife who had deferred to Richard's every whim was gone, replaced by a woman who could navigate complex decisions, lead ambitious projects, and inspire others to rise. But the deepest shift was in how I measured my worth. Once I'd gauged it by how well I propped up Richard's career or kept our home harmonious, equating success with peace at any cost. Now I saw it in the lives I touched, the problems I solved, the futures I helped build. The foundation had given me a purpose that was both intimately personal and vast in its reach. Each challenge, learning new skills, taking risks, stepping into daunting roles had forged me into someone stronger, more certain of her place in the world. As the third anniversary of William's death neared, I found myself reflecting on the arc of my transformation. 3 years ago, I was a discarded wife, adrift with no clear path. Now I was a philanthropist, a leader whose voice mattered, a woman who had built a legacy from ruins. The journey hadn't been easy. It demanded I unlearn decades of self-doubt, embrace risks, and grow into roles that once felt impossibly large. But each step had revealed new strengths, new possibilities. Looking back, I realized William had seen something in me I hadn't, a potential stifled by a circumstance, a capacity for impact I'd never claimed. His inheritance wasn't just financial, it was a vote of confidence in who I could become. That faith filled me with gratitude, not only for the resources, but for the belief he'd placed in my heart and mind. He'd wagered $15 million on my ability to wield his gift wisely, and every day I strove to honor that trust, to prove his vision of me was right. As I stood in my closet, fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of an emerald green gown, a quiet pride swelled within me. 3 years ago, I was a woman frozen in a conference room, reeling from the news that I had inherited a fortune I never expected. That version of me was uncertain, her identity tethered to a marriage that diminished her worth. Now I was someone else entirely, a woman who could command a room of influential donors, articulate the complexities of social issues with clarity, and inspire others to join a mission that burned brightly in my heart. The Portland Art Museum, with its grand architecture and timeless elegance, felt like the perfect stage for the Blackwood Foundation's annual gala, a celebration of the vision and resources that had transformed lives. Tonight, we would unveil our plan to expand the Eleanor Blackwood Centers to 5 new cities over the next 3 years, a bold step toward amplifying our impact. As I slipped into the gown, not to impress, but because it made me feel powerful and true to myself, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. If Richard had inherited his father's wealth, as everyone had assumed, I'd likely still be in Salem, shelving books part-time at the library, my life defined by a man who never saw my potential. Instead, I was preparing to host an event that would raise millions to change lives, a testament to the unexpected rewards of duty, just as Williams had once promised. The gala surpassed every hope I dared to hold. The museum's galleries had been transformed into a vibrant tapestry of our mission. Vibrant paintings and sculptures from our art therapy programs lined the walls, each piece a testament to the resilience of the women we served. Photographs captured the journey of our facilities, from blueprints to bustling centers of hope, while interactive displays quantified the ripple effect of our work on the community. The guest list was a constellation of influence: business magnates, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, and program graduates ready to share their stories with potential donors. By night's end, we had raised $3.4 million, nearly 40% above our goal, fueling our national expansion with unprecedented momentum. But the evening's heart lay in the testimonials, particularly when Maria Santos took the stage. In a navy blue dress she'd earned through her own hard-won success, with her children beaming in the front row, Maria stood with a quiet strength that silenced the room. 3 years ago, she told the hushed crowd, she had arrived at the Eleanor Blackwood Center broken, a survivor of abuse, penniless, without skills or hope, convinced she deserved her suffering. Her voice, steady and resonant, traced her journey to becoming an assistant manager at a thriving accounting firm, a homeowner, and a mother whose children were thriving. This transformation, she said, her gaze sweeping the room, was possible because one woman believed everyone deserves a second chance, that dignity and potential can flourish with the right support. The ovation that followed thundered for nearly 5 minutes, tears glinting in the eyes of even the most stoic guests. I watched Maria, marveling at her grace, a far cry from the woman who once shrank from eye contact, apologizing for existing. She was the embodiment of everything I dreamed our programs could achieve. As the evening drew to a close, I wove through the crowd, discussing our expansion plans and answering questions about our programming model. The energy was electric, with guests proposing new partnerships and initiatives to deepen our impact. But amid the hum of conversation, a familiar figure near the museum's entrance caught my eye. My daughter Sarah had flown in from Boston, a surprise that stirred a tangle of joy and pain, given the distance that had grown between us since the divorce. She looked radiant in a black cocktail dress, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo that mirrored my own at her age. When she approached, her expression blended pride with uncertainty. "Mom," she said softly, "this event, everything you've built, it's incredible. I had no idea you could do something like this." Her words carried admiration, but also a faint sting, a reminder that she had once seen me as less capable, less extraordinary. Still, her presence warmed me. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It means more than you know." We moved to a quieter corner of the museum, away from the dwindling crowd. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke again. "Mom, I owe you an apology. When Dad left, when Grandpa's will changed everything, I didn't understand. I was angry and I blamed you for not holding the family together." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "But seeing what you've done, how you've used that inheritance to change lives, it's made me see I was wrong." What followed was the most honest exchange we'd had in years. Sarah shared her struggles, her wariness of relationships after our family's collapse, her relentless pursuit of a finance career that left her empty despite the accolades. "Watching you tonight," she said, "so passionate, so fulfilled, it makes me question what I'm chasing. You found something that matters, something real. I don't know if I can say that about my life." Her words stirred a bittersweet ache, sorrow for the years we'd lost, hope for what we might rebuild. "Sarah," I said gently, "it took me 62 years to find work that feels like it's mine. You have time to discover what matters to you, to ask the questions that lead to purpose." We talked for an hour, sharing perspectives on careers, family, and the meaning of success, and made plans for her to visit the foundation's facilities the next day. As she left for her hotel, I felt a spark of hope for our relationship, a belief that something beautiful might rise from the ashes of our past. A whirlwind of energy enveloped our team as we pushed forward with ambitious plans to expand our foundation's reach across the United States. Architects, program developers, and site selection experts collaborated tirelessly, poring over maps and data to pinpoint ideal locations for new centers in Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Dallas. Each city brought its own distinct flavor, a unique blend of challenges and possibilities that demanded tailored strategies to meet the specific needs of its communities. The diversity of these places stirred a mix of excitement and apprehension within me. Every decision felt like a puzzle piece that could either fit perfectly or disrupt the entire picture. The weight of creating something meaningful for each community pressed heavily on my heart, but it also fueled my determination to get it right. In Seattle, we set our sights on a beautifully restored warehouse nestled in a neighborhood pulsing with redevelopment. The building's exposed brick and high ceilings seemed to hum with potential, as if it too was eager to serve a greater purpose. This center was to be our flagship, a testing ground for bold new ideas. We forged partnerships with local tech giants, envisioning programs that would equip women with computer skills and open doors to jobs in the booming tech industry. The thought of women, once sidelined by hardship, stepping confidently into careers that shaped the future filled me with pride, though I couldn't shake a quiet fear that we might overpromise and underdeliver. The stakes felt impossibly high, but the vision of transformation kept us pressing forward. Phoenix, however, presented a challenge that tugged at my soul in a different way. A coalition of local organizations had invited us to establish a center focused on undocumented women, women who lived in the shadows, vulnerable to exploitation and abuse because of their immigration status. The complexity of their plight hit me hard. I imagined their fear, the constant looking over their shoulders, the ache of being unseen yet so desperately in need. Navigating the legal and political minefield of serving this population was daunting. One misstep could jeopardize their safety or our mission. Yet the potential to change lives was undeniable. We partnered with immigration attorneys in advocacy groups, crafting programs that offered support regardless of legal status, shelter, job training, and connections to resources that could help stabilize their immigration situations. The work demanded extra security measures and specialized staff training, which stirred a knot of anxiety in my chest. What if we couldn't protect them fully? Still, the thought of giving these women a lifeline, a chance to reclaim their dignity, made every sleepless night worth it. Each new center was more than just an expansion. It was a chance to refine our approach, to learn from our Portland facility's successes and shortcomings. The Portland Center had been our proving ground, where we'd seen what soared and what stumbled. Now we wove those lessons into every new plan, creating programs that were both adaptable to local needs and anchored in the principles that defined our mission. Our staff had grown to include experts in program evaluation, quality assurance, and continuous improvement. People whose meticulous work ensured we didn't just hope for impact, but measured it. We tracked everything: job placement rates, housing stability, even the academic progress of the children in our programs. The numbers painted a vivid picture. 93% of women who completed our 18-month program were employed or pursuing higher education at graduation. A year later, 87% lived in stable homes. The children of our participants showed marked improvements in school performance and social confidence. These statistics were more than data points. They were proof that lives were changing, that futures were being rewritten. But beyond the numbers were the stories, the raw human truths that made my heart swell and ache in equal measure. Letters poured in from graduates, each one a window into a life transformed. They wrote of new jobs, diplomas earned, homes secured, and milestones celebrated. Photos arrived too, smiling families in their own apartments, women clutching professional certifications, children laughing at soccer games or science fairs, moments that would have been unthinkable during the crises that first brought them to us. Each letter felt like a gift, a reminder that our work wasn't just about systems or programs, but about real people finding their way back to hope. One letter from Jennifer Walsh, a former teacher who'd completed our program in its second year, stopped me in my tracks. I could still picture her when she first arrived at the Portland Center. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes heavy with defeat, her teenage daughter trailing behind, uncertain of their future. Jennifer had lost her teaching career, her home, her sense of self. Yet, in her letter, she shared that she'd not only returned to teaching, but had been promoted to assistant principal at a Portland elementary school. Her daughter had earned a full scholarship to study engineering at Oregon State University, and Jennifer herself was newly engaged to a fellow educator who shared her passion for justice and learning. Reading her words, I felt tears prick my eyes. "You didn't just save my life, you gave me back my future. I came to you believing I was worthless, that I'd failed my daughter and myself. Your program reminded me of my own strength, my own value. I'm who I am today because you saw something in me I couldn't see myself." Her gratitude was humbling, but it also carried a weight, a reminder of the immense responsibility we held to keep showing up, to keep believing in every woman who walked through our doors. That responsibility shaped every decision I made. Every dollar spent, every policy crafted, every program designed had the power to ripple through lives in ways I could scarcely comprehend. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. I threw myself into learning, enrolling in nonprofit management courses, attending conferences on social innovation, and connecting with other foundations tackling similar issues. The intellectual challenge rekindled a spark I hadn't felt since my early days as a teacher, when I'd poured my heart into helping students discover their potential. Back then, I'd worked with individual children in a single classroom. Now I was shaping systems that could touch thousands of lives. The scale of it sometimes left me breathless, wondering if I was truly up to the task. Yet the possibility that our model could redefine how society addressed domestic violence and economic vulnerability kept me grounded. I imagined the women we serve becoming mentors, their resilience inspiring others, creating waves of change far beyond our centers. As the 5th anniversary of William's death approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The grief that had once consumed me after my husband Richard left had morphed into a fierce sense of purpose. The financial security I'd once thought impossible had become a tool to empower others. But more than that, I'd uncovered parts of myself I hadn't known existed, strengths and passions buried during my marriage. The woman who'd once doubted her ability to make decisions now led a multi-million-dollar foundation and influenced national policy. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to speak with conviction, to command respect in rooms where power was currency. I'd built friendships rooted in shared values, not obligation. I'd crafted a life that felt true to who I was, not just acceptable to others. The contrast with my past was stark. During my marriage, my worth had been tied to supporting Richard's ambitions, keeping our home running smoothly, avoiding conflict at all costs. Success meant making others happy, even at the expense of my own voice. Now my worth lay in the impact I could have, the problems I could solve, the opportunities I could create. The cost of this change hadn't been small. My divorce strained my relationship with my children, though my daughter Sarah's presence at a recent gala hinted at healing. I'd lost friends who couldn't reconcile with the confident, outspoken woman I'd become. But the gains were immeasurable. I'd found work that set my mind and heart ablaze, relationships that valued my leadership, and a sense of purpose that felt eternal. William's inheritance had been more than money. It was a belief in my potential, a trust in my judgment that had proven prophetic. As I stood in my Portland home, gazing out at the city below, gratitude washed over me. The woman who'd once been told she didn't belong had carved out space for hundreds of others. The wife discarded like a relic had become a leader whose voice mattered. The future that had once terrified me was now richer than I could have dreamed. William had said duty wasn't always rewarded as expected. And he was right. Sometimes it was rewarded with the chance to discover you were capable of far more than you ever imagined.